Welcome back to Worth the Effort Woodworking, and today we are starting Chapter 4 in our classroom series. It's going to deal all with hand planes. Now if you remember, Chapter 1 was basically an introduction to woodworking, where we talked about the fundamentals of pretty much all of our woodworking tools and how it came down to how a blade interacts with wood. In the second chapter, we dove deep into that concept, in that the foundation tool for everything we use, except maybe laser cutters, is the chisel. And we talked about different aspects and how the design affects it. I mean, this looks like an incredibly simple tool, but the complexities and thought people go into making them really does stand out. Everything from metallurgy to shape to ergonomics for your body, all that kind of stuff plays into it. We also delved into the key aspect of how that cutting edge interacts with grain. And we went even further and showed you how you can cut pretty much every single woodworking joint in our craft with just the chisel. And that's important because this is such a flexible tool. Anytime you run into a situation or run into a problem where something's not working just the way you want, pretty much the solution's always going to be pick up a chisel. Now the third chapter was all about hand saws, which is basically a row of chisels and the different variations of it. And we talked a lot about body mechanics, body physics, the teeth structure, how to maintain the saws, how to sharpen the saws so that it lasts a good long time, because by far the saw is the smartest hand tool we have. It will cut a straight line every single time as long as we don't screw it up. I mean, all you gotta do is get out of its way and it wants to cut straight. Well, Chapter 4, we are going to continue on with our hand tools and talking about hand planes, which is basically a chisel in a jig. Now, by the end of this chapter, you're going to be fairly familiar with bench planes, specialty planes, joinery planes, and all the intricacies, all the finickiness of it, all the persnickety-ness of it, and you will understand that this is by far the stupidest tool we have. Now right here is my collection of hand planes that I want to call my users. And even though these over here I barely ever touch, these right here are my main ones. And I hang on to them because, well, a lot of them are just for demonstration purposes, so I can talk to people like you to show you different variations, which we're going to be doing in this video. And some of them have sentimental value. This is the first set I ever made, and obviously I've improved it a lot since then on these newer designs, but I don't want to get rid of them. And really, you don't have much money invested in them. In fact, hand planes are really kind of a sound investment. I mean, if you think about it, the guy that bought this original Miller Falls number 5 way back in, what, the 30s or 40s? Well, he either sold it or passed it down to his kids, and it maintains its value. I know I probably paid 50, 60 bucks for it 7, 8 years ago. And I could probably get 80, 85 bucks for it now. So it's not that it's gaining value or losing value, it just kind of maintains its position, even though I'm using it. And that's the thing about a lot of these. You can buy low as long as you buy smart, maintain your value, save it for a little bit, use it for what it's worth, and then maybe sell it and get yourself something a little bit nicer later on down the road to end up with a really nice collection. Now right here is a traditional jointer, wood-bodied. I wanted to say I tried to date it. It does have a chip breaker on it, so you know it is late 1800s, early 1900s. But I mean, these are still functional, and we're going to explain that as we go along. This one was found in a flea market or something like that by my sister, and I just hang on it for sentimental values. I mean, she gave it to me. Here was an early prototype of this one right here, and what made these kind of cool is this thing right here is really heavy. I've got, all of these are lined with lead. The downside to them is they're not as comfortable as my more modern ones, but I want to hang on to them because these are kind of the first planes I ever made. And they make nice wall decorations. Here are some molding plane and a filter plane. And I got this just to explain how easy it is to work, even though I don't really do much molding. And the filter plane I picked up for about 10 bucks, and I always had this dream of remaking it because all the wood's kind of shot on it, cracked, but all the hardware is nice, so I just kind of hang on to it. When I first got into woodworking, you know, I was an idiot and I followed everyone's guidelines and I got rabbet planes, but I never use these and they don't work very well, but I restored them, so I just hang on to them to begin with. And I keep a number Stanley block plane just to show people how good an inexpensive plane can be. And for some reason at one point in time I wanted to have a little router plane collection, but that was being stupid. So most of these right here are pretty much wall decorations I have way up in the ceiling, but like most woodworkers, it's kind of stuff you pick up over time, so it was never really a big investment. Now here's my first spoke shave, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to kind of gloss over the spoke shaves because I have another video on spoke shaves that I'll put a link down below to that'll go into a lot more detail. And here is actually the first woodworking tool I ever made by hand. So I hold on to that one, and this one I do use occasionally as a big roughing spoke shave. But I've since gotten better ones, so I just hang on to this one because it's easy to use. And this was actually the first new tool I ever bought. This was given to me by my dad for Christmas whenever I first got into woodworking, so I hang on to it, but honestly, I don't use it that much anymore. My chisel skills have gotten up to the point, as y'all saw in the second chapter, that this is somewhat of a redundancy. But it's nice to hang on to. Now here's what most people consider bench planes. I got number 4, number 5 in both a Stanley and a Miller Falls. I will tell you this, I much prefer Miller Falls over the Stanley. And then I have a number 7. I have these on my back wall just because I occasionally do explanations of stuff. I don't use these very often, but I will go into a lot of detail on how to use them and how to set them up, and we might even do a restoration of one of them, because this is where a lot of people start out. They get hand-me-downs from grandparents, or somebody gifts them something, or they pick an inexpensive one up off the market. I will go out on a limb right here and say, in my opinion, a lot of the modern day planes are just much, much better, and you'll understand why when we talk about the adjustments. But once again, these are just really hung on to in order to demonstrate. Right here are my main set of planes. And I say that because these are the tools that touch most of my hand tool projects. These square ones, cabinets, boxes, that kind of stuff. What you got are my main 2 hand planes. I have a very traditional toted coffin style smoother, and this is the first class I ever took on making tools. And before this chapter is over, I will probably do a artsy-fartsy video on how to make a classic coffin smoother, and then I'll do another video on how to make a Krenov style in a small production batch. So if you want to just buy the blades and then end up with a bench set of smoother, jack, and jointer, kind of like I did on that first set I did, well then you can do a small production run using those techniques to save time and add a little accuracy. Those are 2 videos that you can expect in somewhere in this Chapter 4 series as ancillary. They won't be named a section in the chapter, just ancillary information. I keep a fairly heavy and large block plane, and I actually use this as a smoother a lot of time for boxes and smaller projects. I think it's an incredibly flexible tool, and it's about the size of a small number 3. Now this right here is a bevel up plane, and we'll discuss bevel up and bevel downs just a little bit in this video, for the simple reason I have almost 30 minutes of content on the differences between bevel ups, bevel downs, the physics that's happening, the body mechanics, the designs, all that kind of stuff in other videos that I'll link down below. So we're just going to gloss over that a little bit because really the wood doesn't care. And then I have a low angle jack plane that is what I use for, you know, a lot of different things because I can replace a blade. It can be an 4-plane with a heavy cambered iron. I've even used it for smoothing like tabletops, bench tops, that kind of stuff. And because a lot of my work is smaller cabinets, boxes, that kind of stuff, it makes a nice jointer. So I mean, for most of my stuff, This is perfectly good. What I really like though is the specialty, the joinery planes, and this will be an entire section of it. Things like your grooving planes, your radiuses planes, your router planes, scraper planes. I make custom grooving planes out, and I have a video out there on how to do that one. It's these specialty planes that really do enhance the enjoyment I have in making cabinets and speeds me up. I mean, people think hand tools are slow, but by the time you set up a router, I mean, I could have put a groove on or 4 or 5 drawer bottoms. I mean, it's just really fast if you have the tool all set up and ready to go, because these are just jigs holding blades. And that is why these things can be so frustrating. I mean, I know a lot of really talented woodworkers that would rather pull out a router or a random orb sander or anything like that than mess with a hand plane. Because it's almost like you need an associate's mechanics certificate in order to adjust these and get them consistent. Or a study of thermodynamics and humidity and stuff to understand why settings change even throughout the day from even the moisture in your hand. I mean, when I say persnickety, these things are finicky. But it's one of those things that once you kind of get a little bit of experience on it and you understand it, the mechanical lessons you learn here will apply to everything. You know, even working on your car. I mean, this is a great way to introduce kids and stuff like that to working with machinery. Because after this, a lot of the minor things are almost intuitive. It's so much more than lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. And now let's talk about using them. I mean, a lot of people get frustrated even after they get them set up that they don't get the results they see on YouTube or what people describe in books and magazines and stuff like that. I mean, it's almost as if you need an aeronautical engineer, because you're dealing with differing planes, vectors, both direction and amplitude. You're dealing with drift, you're dealing with angles. I feel like you need that beautiful mind, math equation, algorithm, syntax, all that kind of stuff, and being able to solve it on the fly just to make a nice shaving and get a smooth result. And that's the subjects, the adjustment, the mechanics, the dynamics of the actual use that we're going to be discussing for the rest of this video. Now for the next little bit, here are some basic terms I want to talk about. The sole of the plane is the base of the plane, whether it be wood or metal, and the metal ones could be corrugated. You have your irons, which is actually the blade. A lot of them planes come with a chip breaker. On a metal one, they're generally fairly thin, but on a wood one, the ones I use from Hawk are kind of thick, and they have a lot of different functions. The bevel of a plane is the part you grind off, not the part you flatten the back of the plane. The inside of a plane, so you basically have a throat, and how close the tooth, the blade is in that is what they're calling the throat. You also have the toe of the plane, the heel of the plane, excuse me, this is called the mouth, and then the throat is kind of that section right in front of the hand plane. And a lot of hand planes, this is adjustable so you can open and close the throat. Now most planes are going to have some kind of angle, and that's the angle that the blade is interacting with the wood. It's not necessarily the angle of the frog, because the frog could be set at one angle, but because of maybe a tapering iron or your chip breaker, or maybe it's bevel up or bevel the edge is bevel up, it's the included angle of all of those that creates an angle of attack for the blade going through the wood. Now for most Stanley style metal planes, that is going to be the frog angle, because these are fairly straight and they're beveled down. So there you go there. And the same can be said for most wood-bodied planes, though a lot of times they have a tapered iron, which you have to take into account. Now this might seem like common sense, but planes have to deal with planes. I mean, maybe that's where they got their name. Flat surfaces, directions, huge planes out there. Normally that would be a board, and boards come to us flat, and mostly planes are trying to make it flat and visually appealing. But you have to deal with multiple planes. And it all goes back to what all woodworking is. The interaction between a blade and grain. So you have the bottom of the sole of the plane and the blade coming through like that. Then you have the wood that it's going to be riding on. Now there's another plane within that wood. You might just think the surface is the plane, but the wood has a mind of its own. Ideally, the grain of that board will be going so that as you move forward with your plane, the other plane is laid down. You're laying those cat hairs down. You're going uphill instead of downhill. Because if you go the other way, you're going to get a lot of tear out and the plane's not going to work right. Now, assuming you are going with the grain, well, you've got different kinds of wood out there. You have hardwoods, softwoods. Generally, for the most part, softwoods can handle a lower angle of attack. So the blade can be dropped down to a lower angle, or if you're using a bevel up, you can get a steeper angle on the bevel to lower it down. That will make it not only push through the wood smoother, but it'll be easier to push through because you're not having to bend that wood up as much. But the harder the wood, the more likely you're starting to get a split above the head of the grain. Because when you start lowering the angle down, it starts acting more like a wedge than an edge. Which is why harder woods or figured woods tend to prefer a steeper angle of attack. I mean, some will even go positive. So you end up with a scraper plane. But that is not the whole story. If I come back over here and go back to a standard, let's say 45-degree angle, that is assuming my vector, my force, is going in line with the plane, in the direction I want to go. That isn't always the case. That's a 2D analogy, and we live in a 3D world. So, let's say you have a hand plane. Most people would think that you push a hand plane forward, but I've always found that's not that comfortable. I typically will angle my hand plane a little bit so that instead of having a vector going straight forward, my vector has a little drift, to steal an airplane analogy. That would be like when the airplane's flying kind of cockeyed, dog-eyed, sideways. Because the wind is coming one direction, the plane wants to go the other direction, it kind of splits and averages out the difference. Same thing with a hand plane. By having it slightly sideways, it's more natural to push forward because I'm not having to twist my shoulders all around. Well, what happens to the angle of attack on the plane interacting with the wood when you do that? Well, I want you to picture somebody skiing. You have your skier going down, 2 skis, your poles, you probably have a kid on a bicycle chasing them, asking for $2. Better off dead reference. But if that skier is going straight down the hill, and that hill is at 45 degrees, well, his angle of attack going down the hill is 45 degrees, and that kid is going really, really fast. That's a maximum speed you can go. That's a maximum angle you can hit. But most of us don't ski like that. We'll come over and we'll ski sideways and we'll weave our way down. Well, if this distance is a short distance, all of a sudden when you start weaving it, that weaving action elongates the time that it takes you to go down, elongates the distance. It makes that hypotenuse a lot longer, thus the angles are a lot longer. But when you are drifting your plane, the same thing is happening to those wood fibers. If you attack a 40-degree frog angle straight on, well, the wood will actually just go straight up the plane blade at 45 degrees. But if you cant it a little bit, then all of a sudden this distance right here, kind of going sideways across that, is a lot longer than the distance just going straight down. So it lowers the angle down. It lowers the hypotenuse by making it longer. Now this ability to lower the angle has a lot of influence on how you use it. I know some people that use a higher frog for the simple reason that they always like to use a smoothing plane at a slight angle because it changes the ability for it to interact with a larger plane. And by that plane, I mean the plane that it's operating on. Look at it like this. I have a board. Let's pretend that this is the sole of a plane. So I come over here and I'm pushing this plane directly straight. Let's just draw an outline. How much of a board is this plane interacting as it goes forward? Well, it's interacting with whatever length the board is and this width right here. But what if you were to cant it, to drift it a little bit? All of a sudden, now you are interacting with this much of the board. So if I'm trying to flatten a board, well, if it's got a little bit of a high spot here and a little bit of a high spot there, this plane right here is just going to make the lower spot lower. But if I have a little bit of a high spot here and a little bit of a high spot there, well, at least this plane, well, this use of the plane will capture those uses, and that in-between spot right there will not get shaved. And then when I move over a little bit, it'll ride in that lower spot there and capture the higher spot. So it kind of goes in and out a little bit better and covers a wider path. So that takes us to the next area of the length of your sole. How does that affect how you're using it? Now I'm going to draw a quick analogy here, guys. So I just want you to go with me, follow along, okay? You got a skateboard. Okay? Skateboard has small wheels, board on top. How many of y'all have been riding down what you feel like visually is a smooth road, but it's maybe got a lot of sand or a little gravel and the skateboard's stopping, jittering all over the place? I mean, you feel everything. Then you go over that same road on a mountain bike. Big old tires coming through. Well, a mountain bike tire, that same gravelly road, might feel glass smooth. And it all has to do with the circumference, or this distance right here that it's traveling. This is a lot shorter distance than the bigger wheel that's a longer distance. Well, think of that as a sole of your plane. When you first get a board, if you're like me and you're trying to go the cheapest route possible, you buy boards in the rough state and you're going to have to plane something flat. Those rough boards are going to have highs and lows, twists and stuff like that. A long plane is going to basically skip over those, and even though it's fairly rough, it's going to feel smooth as you're going across it because it's only going to be hitting the high spots. It's going to be hitting off the low spots, and it keeps working that until all the high spots are gone, and you're making a smooth shaving taking all the way across. Now, if you were to take something like a smoothing plane or a block plane to that same board, you would make it look smooth, but in actuality, it still wouldn't be flat because the shorter wheelbase would be going in and out, and it would just be taking off enough to engage both sides of it and have that blade touch. So the longer blade tools are generally there to flatten wood. Now, if you get a really flat board, like that road we were talking about, well, it might have some little pits like that, or little undulations that you wouldn't feel. I don't know, something called tear out. The plane, the jointer plane would just gloss over all that stuff. The minor pebbles, it's just going to gloss over it. Whereas a smoothing plane being shorter, well, it will definitely feel those smaller undulations, and at least the blade will touch those undulations so that you can get the tear out or the smoothness out. That's why they're called smoothing planes. You generally take a very fine shaving because all it is there for cosmetics. So you have this concept of, I think Christopher Schwartz brought it out, of coarse, medium, fine, but they have other terms on it. It's just modern terms for old ideas. Where the jointers, the big long planes, You use them. You take big, thick shavings or fairly heavy shavings just to get the majority of the work done, take off all the high spots and that kind of stuff, and get it to a flat surface that can then be prepared for a finish via a smoothing plane. Now, the weird thing is, a lot of times when it's really, really rough, what they will do is they will have their big long jointers, you will have your smoother, and then you'll have that intermediary spot. Some people call it a floor plane. A little bit smaller plane than that would be a jack plane. And they will set up to take a really heavy cut because they will kind of eyeball the thickness. They're not using that kind of stuff for the whole board. They're just going, oh, it's got some twist in it. Let's just take off this corner, that corner, get those down close, and then we'll hit it with that jointer. And the jointer will take off a little bit less than that middle of the road plane. These things do the brunt of the work. These things make it efficient and flat. These make it pretty. That's kind of why the smoothing planes get the most glory, and really good smoothing planes are highly prized, because when you start getting the fine details, the fine adjustments, that's when it gets really finicky, and a little bit off will affect it because it's taking such a fine shaving. A jointer, you just want it to be flat on bottom. Why do you need it flat on bottom? Because theoretically a hand plane can never make anything flat. Now, if you have a short plane like a smoothing plane and you extend that blade below the surface of the sole, you have basically created a curve of interaction, because the plane is going to take off the wood at the bottom portion of that blade, and it's going to touch in the front, and then it's going to touch in the back. There's that curve. So why does a longer plane make a smoother surface? Well, if you extend that sole out, that curve is a lot less. My drawing skills are pretty bad here, because it's spread over a longer distance. Now, if you have your blade just going down a few thousandths of an inch, that curvature is completely imperceptible to a person. And whenever we join stuff up, just a little pressure with clamps or glue or even your hand, it's going to bend even a fairly thick board to get it just dead perfectly flat. And it's flat enough for woodworking. But I just wanted to point that out, that theoretically a hand plane cannot make a perfectly flat surface. Whereas a mechanical power jointer, how those work, just a side note, is that you have your cutting blades coming over, you have one bed that's lower, one bed that's higher, and the wood feeds this way, it gets cut off right there, and it comes out right there. So theoretically, that part that you're removing is in line with the sole of the plane. And in fact, that's kind of how Japanese planes work, because a lot of times the back section is a little bit lower than the front section to make it plain, dead flat. Yeah, their tools and joinery is a little bit more sophisticated sometimes. So, am I freaking you out with a giant brain dump yet? Let's go to grab a plane and grab a board and see how these things are actually interacting in real life. So right here I have a southern yellow pine board, an oak board, and a cherry board. So just to show you, I'm going to be using my general purpose wooden hand plane, not really a smoother, not really a jack, just kind of all around machine. Make sure I've got the grain going somewhat the way I want, uphill. So I plane it. If I go with the pine, I can go straight across, take off the high spots and get me a nice shaving. And there we go, fairly thin shaving coming off. Got a pretty sharp blade in there right now. But if I start lowering the plane blade angle, not only do the shavings change, but it's a lot easier for me to control it, and I can get finer and finer cuts, and it gets a little bit smoother, because as you lower the angle of attack, you're also increasing the sharpness. It's weird how it works that way. But at a certain point, you get diminishing returns. Now, I was going pretty angled on that last pass. If I did that same thing with oak, really low angle of attack. Well, let me get it flat first. It's got some machine marks on it. So we're starting to get nice shavings coming off of it. It's nice and smooth, but my angle of attack is the 45 degrees I have right here. I start lowering that angle of attack, and all of a sudden, you're going to start getting tear out because the oak is going to split. So can you see all that tear out? Let's see if it shows up in the camera. Little white spots, fibers being ripped out because I was acting at it at too low an angle. Whereas on this side where I hit it with a nice 45 degree angle, it's pretty smooth. Same thing might happen with the cherry. Get it smooth. Start taking shavings off of it. I've gotten it nice and glass smooth. Can you see that? See the reflection of the hand plane blade in it? Maybe not. You can somewhat see the reflection color change in there. Now watch what happens if I start angling it. Oh yeah, you can feel the tear out coming. See the little divots that are happening all along. It's just got too low an angle at that point. When I take 45 and I split it in half, now you're looking at a 20 degree angle, which is just way too low for cherry. Now let's play around with my workbench, okay? So it's fairly flat, but it's not perfectly flat. I don't really care if it is perfectly flat, but it'll give us a good reference because it's nice and dirty. So anywhere I plane on it, you're going to see the color change. So if I simply take my hand plane going with the grain this way and I go straight at it, you can see it takes off certain spots here and there, but misses some spots like right there. Boom, okay? But if I were to plane it off this way over that same area, well, theoretically, it should be smoother now because I just planed it. But because there's going to be variations in height on this side and that side, you're going, oh, I just skipped over this entire section right here. It's not taking any kind of shavings, even though it's shaved over there. And that's how I can know that it's going to be in plane all over the place. It's not going to be little valleys in line of the path. So when you're smoothing, you have to take in consideration that. It might be, if you're smoothing something really hard, that you need a pretty steep angle so that you can come over wider spots and just hit. See how much less I'm taking off because I'm pushing it at this angle. Whereas if I were to just go straight with the grain, it's taking the big shavings. I think what I'm trying to really drive home here is that using a plane is all about planes and angles. And life is not 2D. So we've got to take into consideration vectors, drift, even the amount of power you push through it will affect everything about that interaction between the cutting edge and wood fibers. And none of this is overly complex. It's kind of common sense when you think about it. But until somebody points it out one time and asks you to really analyze what's going on, it might not register. But none of those planes and angles will work unless you can get a sharp edge, which we covered sharpening in an earlier chapter, and you can get it set up right, which means dealing with mechanics. Now I kind of like wooden bodied planes. Call it the Neanderthal in me, but they're really only 3 moving parts and you adjust them by banging them. But let's take a quick look, because the design of these things, I mean, it dates back to pre-Egyptian age. People have been using this style plane much longer than they've been using, metal body planes, even though those get the credit nowadays. It's just an incredibly simple device, and once you get a feel for them, they're really easy to adjust, easy to work with. So most wood planes are going to come with a hammer to adjust them, and I really like these little kind of rubber and hard nylon ones. Use that on the steel, this on the wood, and really what we're looking at is as basic as you can get. You have a plane, you still have the sole, you have the mouth, the throat is set from either the construction area, and a lot of people will end up, if they buy a plane that's been worn down quite a bit, meaning they've sanded the bottom flat quite a bit, the mouth kind of opens up over time, so they'll put a little shim right there of harder wood. And a lot of them will do that even before it wears out. For the simple reason, a lot of people think a plane sole has to be dead flat, and that just is not true. You really only are concerned with this section right here, the part right in front of the mouth, and the tail. Anything else can be out of flat. So you see all those guys that, they'll put a straight edge up to their plane to test it out for flatness. They see a little bit of gap here or here, they freak out, and they want to resand the whole thing. Well, that's just, it's illogical. These 3 spots are all you need to care about. Those are the only ones that need to be in plane. In fact, I know a lot of woodworkers, and especially a lot of Japanese planes, they'll actually take a hand card scraper and they'll start scooping out this section right here, because it creates somewhat of a vacuum and really sucks the plane down once you get it really flat, and there's less friction. So until it is flat, it's just easier to work with. Plus, when you do want to flatten it, it's quite a bit easier. Now, wooden planes, they do require some maintenance, and you are going to flatten the bottom a lot more than a steel plane. A steel plane, you really shouldn't ever have to flatten after it's initially flat. And that's just because of normal wood movement. And that is also why they make the blanks out of a tree a certain way, so that it moves a certain way. And it all comes down to moisture in the air. And that is also why a lot of people on like smoothing planes prefer this coffin shape, because it exposes a lot of ingrain. There's a lot of, there isn't that much that water has to move to equalize. And once it's equalized, it's fairly flat. I found on this plane right here, I flattened it about a month after I got it, and then probably once a season I'll put some 220 sandpaper down, and really that's about all I do, and it's ready to rock and roll. Once they get kind of seasoned or used to your environment, they don't really move that much. But here's where we start getting with the mechanics. A lot of people look at these plane blades and see the nice flat backs to them and stuff like that, and they assume that you want a nice flat section right here. Well, that's not always the case. What you want is a good mating surface, and this isn't perfectly flat. So when you're making a wooden plane like this, a lot of times what I will do is I will put carbon paper right here. I'll put it into the hand plane right about where it is, and I'll kind of wiggle it a little bit so that the carbon comes off. And you can see a little bit of the carbon still on here, but me doing this every now and then. And then you just scrape away whatever you see is black. At that point, you'll get a perfectly mating surface, and that will make this kind of plane adjustment so much easier, because if you have a high spot in one section or the other, once you put pressure on that one spot, that becomes a pivot point, and you don't want a pivot point. You want even friction all the way across, so that as the plane gets adjusted, it moves equally all over the place. The same way when you design these, you want them to actually mate to the blade. Now, when I did this class, all they did was they went and got some 01 tool steel, and they kind of blocked it and squared off this, and we ground our sections off of it, and it's all treated. Most wooden hand planes are going to have a tapered iron, and it's one of those interlocking things that you think about with mechanics. So if I have this tapering thinner here, this tapering thicker there, well, they wedge together to form into the holding structure for the plane. What's even cooler is if you think about it, the pressure when you're using the plane is pushing that blade back. But if it is tapered thicker on bottom and it's pushing up into another taper, well, they kind of lock themselves together and they just don't move, because you physically can't move a thick section into the thinner section. So the tapered iron really does make this style of plane so much more stable and easier to use. It won't change adjustment that often. Now, if you look at some modern day planes, wooden planes like this Krenov style, well, they have a chip breaker, a cap iron on it. The blade itself is not tapered, but the chip breaker, when you take it off, you will see that there's a little bit of an air gap right there. So in fact, because this chip breaker is bent, so it's got contact back here and contact on the blade, it creates a thicker section here than towards the back. So the chip breaker itself adds that taper. The same can be said with a modern hand plane right here. Look at it. The chip breaker itself is equal thickness all the way around, but they bent it so it is thicker down here than it is over here. It also, by that bending action, that spring action, it puts a lot of pressure down here and it reduces the chatter. But the other thing about adding a chip breaker is it adds mass, and the more mass you add to a blade, the more stable it's going to be as it goes through boards. That's why one of the more common accessories to this style hand plane when people restore them is they will get a replacement blade that's a little bit thicker to increase the mass even more. The reason why they made them thin was because steel was very expensive when these were first being made. In fact, the earliest one you can see will have a lamination line where they'll put the really nice steel down on bottom and then just regular steel up top, just to save money. Then when steel became cost effective enough, they just made the whole thing out of the same material. Anyways, we got a little bit sidetracked there. So we have our most basic of hand plane right here. A body, a blade, and a wedge to hold it. So when I set it up, what I would do is I will position the blade so that I have some slop on either side. See how it kind of moves back and forth? I want to get it dead center, and I want to make sure that my blade is ground so it will sit flat. And then I can put the wedge in, and because it's sitting on a flat surface, whenever I tap this, you'll probably extend that blade just an ever so slight amount. And the easy way to tell is to put your finger underneath and pull it back and forth, and you'll be able to feel the thickness. And that's something, as you adjust planes, whether they be wood or metal bodied, get in the habit of running that finger along the bottom after you get it all adjusted, because you'll develop a feel for it, and you can feel the thickness a lot better than you can see it. So I can say, oh, I'm heavy on this side, lighter on this side, so I can make an adjustment. Now, when you're adjusting a plane like this, you kind of refer back to Newton's laws. Something at rest tends to stay at rest. Something in motion tends to stay in motion. Well, right now we have 3 different masses, this being the most dense one. So if I am a little bit heavy on this side versus this side, I want this blade to cant a little bit this way. And that's one reason why they take off the corners, because you can actually tap the blade, and because the blade started moving, this stayed still, so now it's a little bit heavier on this side than that side. And after every adjustment, a light tap on the wedge just in case it comes off. Now, wooden body planes often have this little button right here, and that button is at a position on the plane to create the biggest impact on the blade. You would think it'd be farther out, but it's something about the vibration of wood that at that point it's the biggest one. And when you're first making a plane, a lot of times you will just make it without the button, and you'll start using it and hammering on it, and you'll kind of find the spot, and that's where it ends up being dented the most. And then on your next plane, you can either put it in that spot, or you can just drill it out right on that dent and put in your button. And the idea is if I hit this right here, the body is going to go down, but this is probably going to stay at the same spot a little bit, plus the fact that the wood is going to vibrate and it's going to push the blade up. So a light tap will retract it. Really, that is all we're talking about, and I can feel the difference. A heavy tap, and it comes apart. Now, when I do adjustments, they do say that you can tap down if you want to progress it. I would typically stick it on a flat piece, give the wedge a tap, and that pretty much progresses it down enough. And the easy way to test it is to keep a little scrap of wood right here, and you can kind of, see if I can get the camera to focus in on that. You can kind of see, hey, it's not taking shavings on this side, it starts taking them towards the middle, and then it fades out right there. So that's pretty much adjusted just the way I want it. I'm getting good thick shavings in the middle, and it kind of feathers out on the side. And why is that? Because I hammer my blades. And we'll discuss blade geometry a little bit later on. Now, another way to make adjustments, and I see this a lot in old videos, I don't see too many people doing it very often, is a lot of masters with the smaller planes, they'll say, oh, I need to adjust the angle a little bit this way. So they'll sit there and they'll just go like that. But it's doing the same thing. If I bang on this side right there, the blade will want to stay still and it will kind of pivot because there's no friction right here on the top of the blade. There's friction on the bottom, so the bottom will kind of grip and they'll want to tilt over. So a good way to make minor adjustments is just a slight wrap on the side, and it will change so that now I am taking a heavier cut on this side, on that side, than I am on this side. You can see the difference. And if you don't have a tote on it, a lot of times people will bring the blade up ever so slightly. Instead of tapping on this side, they will tap there. So let's review. If I want to adjust a plane, basically I assume that the blade will stay still, and if I tap this way, it's going to rotate the blade a little bit deeper on that side because this portion of the blade will stay still and it'll kind of pivot. If I want to tap it the other way, I can do the same thing. I can even tap up here to make micro adjustments down there because you're farther from the impact point. If I want to retract the blade a little bit, micro adjustments with this kind of tool, just a lighter tap. That right there will make changes. Retap through wedge. If I want to progress it deeper, you can tap on the front. And that'll make it go down that was quite a bit deeper, just by feeling it with my fingers I can tell. Retract it. It's pretty much retracted back to where it was. And you're going to develop that feel. So the mechanics we've been talking about has a lot to do with Newton's laws and wedging action. Pretty simple, really. A little bit of time feeling it out. You might be frustrated a few times as you're setting it up until it gets just dialed in, especially if you use a smoother, because smoothers are the most finicky. But a little bit of experience and you'll find out that each plane has a unique personality. You'll learn that personality, and making adjustments will go really pretty quickly. I find that, after a little bit of experience, I can adjust these a lot quicker than I can the metal ones. Just takes a little bit of time. Okay, next up I have what probably most of y'all are going to start out with, a nice metal plane. This is a Stanley number 5, a Bailey pattern, and that's pretty much been knocked off by everybody on the design. And my personal opinion, if you're going to go vintage, go ahead and invest in either a Bailey one that actually says Bailey on it, or a Bedrock, or go for the Miller Falls style. These three right here, they're so price competitive. The Bedrocks are going to be quite a bit more expensive. And FYI, the Bedrock style is what the Lee Nielsen, the kind of the premium hand plane in this style that's made new, was based off of, the Bedrock. I personally like the Miller Falls a little bit better. I think it's a cooler design. And I'll set aside this chip Raker aside to show it to you a little bit later on. But most people, they're going to be getting the Bailey. And I'm going to disassemble most of this right now so we can talk about the individual parts, and then as I reassemble it, tuning it, we can talk about those mechanical lessons I was discussing earlier. So right now, you have the cap iron. And the cap iron basically has a spring on back that you can see will adjust back and forth, and a flat. And basically all this is designed to do is lock the blade down to the frog. You have your blade. You come over, the blade is made up of a chip breaker and an iron, and you have this screw right here. So I'm going to take that apart. And if you notice, the cap iron, as I said earlier, is spring steel. It's designed to flex and hold a lot of tension. And they put this curve in it to put that spring right on the very edge of the blade. Now, in the description down below, I'm going to put a link to a Japanese video where they talked about cap irons or chip breakers and other chip breakers, and their influence on the quality of a cut. And it is that video right there that kind of told me that for the kind of woodworking I do, with using domestic, very bland, straight grain material, I like using that kind of wood. The curly stuff are accent pieces. I just like traditional stuff. The chip breaker is really not that necessary, and it doesn't influence the final cut. And more than likely, it's just going to cause problems. So I have a whole video on dealing with the chip breaker and its #1 solutions. I'll put that link down below, but I'm also going to put a link to that Japanese video. And yes, it is subtitled, but it is one of the more interesting analytical videos on what's happening at the cutting edge using a chip breaker. It really opened up my eyes. Okay, now on the inside we have our frog, and I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And the screws come with these washers. You will a lot of times find on vintage planes that the washers are missing. Well, you need to replace them because they do enhance the usability of a plane. Without them, it just doesn't work as well. And then the frog will come off as a complete piece. You can adjust the screw right here for the chip breaker in and out. And on the back, you have your frog adjustment lever and a screw on this little kind of dog bone, wishbone kind of thing that moves that back and forth. That engages with the chip breaker to adjust your depth of cut. And then you have this sliding adjuster that also engages with the entire setup to move it left and right. Now the inside of the plane, you're going to have a couple flats. One back here and one right there. These two screw holes are the screws that hold the frog into place. Those two you want to be very smooth and clean because that's what the frog pivots off of. This is the front. It pivots off of it right there and right in back. And those are in plane. A lot of times you're going to find a lot of rust on those, and that rust acts as grit to allow it not to slide back and forth. And then you have this adjuster screw right here, which honestly on mine, once I get these set, I never really touch them, but you can move it in and out, and that will engage with this right here. Okay? But I want you to notice something. If you look at this distance right here on that adjuster, it slots in right here. When you are doing a machine like this, you cannot have it fit perfectly. This has to be wider than that, otherwise it just won't go together. And that difference between the thickness here and the thickness there, a lot of us call slop. So what we have right here is we have our frog, we have our blade, we have our chip breaker coming over. We have that frog adjustment, comes down and it slots into that little screw. This distance right here is that tolerance or that slop. Now the thing is, if you want to back the frog up for whatever reason, maybe it's you're taking a thicker shavings, or you've gotten it so thin that the shavings aren't coming up, so everything's getting jammed up all the time and you just get frustrated, you just want to back it off so that your plane will work more consistently. I personally keep the frog pretty far back because of that Japanese video I showed you that it doesn't really affect that much. Anyways, so you want to back it up. So you move this screw back farther so that the thread rests on the front side of the adjuster. Okay? You get it back to where you are just got it perfect. Everything's lined up. There's nothing wrong with it. You start taking a few shavings and all of a sudden it stops working again. So you use your screw up here to push the blade down a little bit more because the frog is locked in, and you start shaking shavings again, getting perfect shavings, and then all of a sudden after a little while it stops taking shavings. What is going on? So you progress the blade forward a little bit, a few more strokes, perfect, and then it stops taking shavings. Well, that's when people just get really frustrated. But what's happening is the force on the blade is going this direction. Okay? So it is pushing the frog and everything back. And you have some slop right here. So what happened is it moves it a little bit, not all the way, because there's a lot of tension in the frog with the screws that are holding it down right here. Remember me talking about those washers? The washers extend the pressure out, so it locks it down a little bit more, so it doesn't move as much. But it'll move it back a little bit, so you have a hairline of slop in front, but you still have a little bit of gap in back. So then you adjust that forward, you make some passes, maybe a little vibration happens in the wood, and it moves the frog back a little bit more. And it'll keep doing that one until this adjuster is resting on the back of that adjuster wheel, and it can't move back much farther. And that's where it's locked in. Which is why, if you're ever backing a blade out, whether you're using a twist grip or you're just using the blade adjustment, you always want to move forward into your settings, because there's no chance that the blade will move back against that slop. And that idea of loose tolerances you find everywhere on a hand plane. So I'm going to come over, and I like to have the frog lined up with the bottom of the mouth right here, because I feel that it gives the blade support as a little bit farther down. But in theory, because of the bevel of the blade, remember the bevel is going down, that bevel is pretty much resting on the frog, not that little back portion of the mouth. So, I mean, in theory, it doesn't do that much. But I will progress it forward. Remember, back it off first and then progress forward until it is flush. There we go. And then I'm going to lock these screws in, making sure I find my washers. Now when you insert these screws, don't over tighten them. The frog isn't something that you're going to be taking off very often, but you know, you might, if this is your only plane, want to be able to adjust it forward and backward. So if you're cutting some curly wood, having the blade close to the mouth will put pressure down on the wood and prevent a little bit of the tear out, because if it starts to split ahead, that mouth is there to push it back down. But it is really common on these Bailey style planes to see the mouth just snapped off. That's because they've moved the blade so far forward that the pressure of the shaving coming out right here just broke off this. And this is pot metal. This is not like the malleable stuff they make planes out of nowadays. If you were to drop this, it would probably break in half. So now let's talk about that chip breaker and blade. And yes, I do have a link down below to an entire video dealing with tuning up your chip breaker, because this right here gives students more of a headache than any part of the plane I know of, because chips get stuck up underneath here and clog the whole device, and then you pretty much have to take the entire blade out to clear them out, which it's just frustrating. Now most people do not totally remove the screw, so what you'll want to do is make sure that the bevel is going up or away from here, drop it on at an angle, progress it forward, and then twist it onto that chip breaker. The reason why is you do not want the chip breaker to touch the edge right there, because it will nick it and you'll have to resharpen everything. And then you can progress it forward, and once again that video will tell you how far to progress it forward, but I'll get it okay close, and then tighten it up. Now another one of the problems that people have with the chip breaker is, you saw how much I tightened it up. Right now that's just finger tight. That is way too loose, because I can still move this on the blade pretty easily. Well, it takes a little bit of effort, but I can slide it around. And all the adjustments of the blade going left, right, up, and down happen right here on the chip breaker. So if this is sliding, what will happen is you're shaving along, that blade will get pushed back up, and then all of a sudden you're shaving off of that chip breaker, and it gets damaged. Then you'll move it, you'll figure out what you did, you'll move it back, you'll really tighten it down so that you know it's not going to go anywhere, and then you'll start shaving, but because that chip breaker's edge is now damaged, shavers are catching up underneath there. So, you know, really tighten that down every single time. Then when you drop it into the plane blade, I see a lot of people that'll just drop it in like that. Don't do it, because the blade is exposed, it's going to be damaged. Lift your plane up so that the frog is flat, then you can lay the blade down and progress it forward until it clicks into the frog's adjuster. And you can see if I twist that down, it goes forward and backwards off of this screw. And then put the clamp down. Now, another frustration. People would put way too much pressure on this. This is just here to hold the blade and chip breaker in place. If your knuckles are turning white to push this down, well, you're never going to be able to adjust it left and right here. It just locks everything down, or move the blade back and forth. You just want it there tight enough that'll hold everything together. Now, we come to adjusting the blade forward and back. So my fingers will go up underneath, and I will be using the scroll wheel right here. Now this right here and the adjustment right there is why the Bailey style was so popular with the old timers, because you can adjust everything without moving your hands here. Whereas this style right here, I need to grab a hammer to make adjustments. So what they would do is, if they only had the one plane, they will progress the plane down, taking a thick shaving to remove a lot of material fast, and then they will back it off until it's taking a thin shaving to groove it, and they'll to finesse it. And they'll do that one without stopping. Their fingers will always be moving. They want to take a little bit more left, right, adjust that right there. You don't have to really let go. It's really flexible adjusting setup. Now, most of us amateurs are never going to do that one. We're going to stop planing, make an adjustment, then go back and plane. That's just how it is. So it's not really that big a benefit. But if you watch those guys, what they do is they were progressing forward. They're moving this down until it's taking a fairly thick shaving. And then when they make a shaving, they'll make a slight, to make it thinner, they'll move it like a quarter right there, and it will not make the adjustment until they push through, because the blade has to be pushed back physically, because remember us talking about that slop? Right now I can move this. Okay, to give you an idea, right now I'm going to move this dial forward until it takes off the slop and it's getting engaged forward, and you'll be able to tell. See, my finger now is sliding. Okay, so let's watch how many turns going backwards until that dog bone, the slop, between the front of this dog bone and the back is taken up. And even on newer planes, sometimes it can be a full turn. There's 1/2 of a turn, another 1/2 of a turn, 1 1/4 turns before the resistance comes on. So 1 1/4 turns before the slop is taken up and the adjustment actually happens. Now, if I went backwards like that to take up the slop and now started moving it backwards, the moment I push forward on the blade, well, that blade's going to push back and take up the slop, and now I'm not making shavings again, and I'm getting frustrated. So what you always want to do is, if you're making shavings, back off and then progress forward until you reach the depth you want. If you are going to back it up a little bit, back it up, take off a little bit of slop, and then make a shavings, and that'll push the blade back until it's engaged in the tolerance again. Now, pretty much every kind of mechanical plane is going to have aspects of that slop, that tolerance, and it's just different for every single one. Rotor planes especially, because if you think about a rotor plane, the blade is kind of an angle and it wants to dive into the wood, so it's constantly wanting to go down. And a lot of us will adjust it down and then take a shaving, and then all of a sudden it's taking a deeper shaving. Because if you're pushing it down, there's slop on the bottom, so if that gap will be taken up the first time that blade engages and wants to go even lower. So you always have to back a rotor plane off. It's just something you got to think about as you use every single different kind of mechanical adjuster. Where's the slop going to be? And that's something that is applied everywhere in mechanics. When you adjust valve, you have tolerances, your feeler gauges, engagement. That's all adjusting the slop so that the machine will have a little bit of flexibility to work properly. So this is really a great way to introduce that kind of tolerance concept to people. But until you understand that, how frustrating is this kind of machinery? Now, earlier I said I preferred the Miller Falls setup because pretty much every single Miller Falls, it might just be because they were a newer brand, you know, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and a lot of these adjusters are brass, and brass wears over time, increasing the amount of slop, but they just seem to be tighter, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I like them. Also, coming back to that lever cap, in comparison to the Bailey style, which is a solid piece, and you have your spring back here, you also have the spring back there, but it's a two-piece setup. There's a little bit of pivoting right there, so it's actually contacting the blade in 3 different spots. So it seems to get a little bit nicer engagement point with less pressure. I mean, it just engages more. So I think it's a better design. Plus, I think the materials that they were using in these more modern ones were obviously a little bit nicer than the older ones. And here's where I'm going to make something kind of controversial statement. If you're actually going to be getting mechanical style planes, iron planes, I really do suggest you invest in something from Lie-Nielsen or Lee Valley, pretty much the 2 premier ones out there, because prices for this kind of stuff have just skyrocketed these past 5 years, and you could probably thank Christopher Schwartz for that, but really it's just kind of a hipster thing to do. So really the price difference between these and the new ones might be $100. Now $100 sounds like a lot, but if you were to put this in the hands of a new woodworker and a Lie-Nielsen or a Veritas one, well, the tolerances are so much better on the newer stuff that it's just a little bit more intuitive, and they're not going to get as frustrated, and they'll want to continue doing it a little bit longer. Plus the fact, as I said, planes like these are pretty good investments. They're not going to lose that much value, even if you're buying one brand new. It's over its lifetime, you know, it'll all work out. Plus the fact that newer ones are made out of ductile iron, which will dent when you drop it instead of cracking like these cast iron ones do. And it just seems that they're a little bit thicker. They're just made nicer. They're made to modern tolerances. We really are in a hand tool renaissance right now, where some of the best quality tools ever are in production. Maybe not as much of a variety as they had back then, but a lot better quality. And really, when you think about it, they're cheaper now than they were back then when you look at an average person's wages. But despite that, even the latest and greatest out there nowadays, I still consider them stupid because they require so much fiddling with to make work perfectly, to make the way I want to do it. Whereas my saws, you know, once I set them up once, I can saw for years with them. My chisel, I just make sure it's sharp and I know what's going to happen with it. A plane, hey, from one day to the next, they might operate a little bit differently, and I'm going to have that mechanical skill to adjust it to serve my needs. They're just stupid. They're like the employee that you just can't send off to do a task. You got to monitor them the whole time. Well, I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and most importantly, I hope you learned the reasons why. Anybody can hand a plane to somebody, show them how to use it, show them what the different adjusters are, and send them off to make shavings. And that can be extremely frustrating if you don't understand why those adjustments work a certain way, and when things go wrong, how you can fix them because you understood the whys. So that's really what I wanted to drive home today. Now, future sections in this chapter 4 will be about specialty planes and joinery planes and stuff like that. Techniques to use them to improve your workflow, even if you're in a power tool shop. Because hand planes and such like that can really make your work a lot more accurate and a lot more efficient. You might not believe it, but, you know, 5 minutes planing on top of a table is a lot better than 45 minutes an hour sanding through all those grits. Plus, the pop of the grain will happen a lot more, and you won't have to worry about raising the grain because you severed those fibers. You haven't muddled them with the braiding. Now, if you did get something out of this video, please understand that I am kind of operating on the value for value proposition. I hope to provide you something of incredible value for a little bit of value back. You can visit my website, wortheffort.com, where I have an online store where I sell tools. Probably have some of these coming up pretty soon. As in addition to a apparel shop where I offer t-shirts, hats, and different kind of swag out there. I also have a section where you can just support us so that we can make more of these. Different kinds of patronage you can offer. All that is available at wortheffort.com. And every little bit does help out. Because, as you all know, it is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun. Oh, and did you see that drawing happening over there? Our latest t-shirt design.